cook was fired for poisoning and the millionaire saw her necklace. The same one he gave his young love before disappearing 25 years ago. The heavy mahogany door of the Jackson estate slammed shut behind Lauren with a finality that echoed through her bones. Her hands trembled as she clutched the cardboard box containing 26 years of her life. A worn apron, a few personal photos, and the small ceramic mug she'd used for her morning coffee breaks. The October wind cut through her thin coat, but it was nothing compared to the ice in Edward Jackson's voice still ringing in her ears. "You're fired. Security will escort you out immediately." She'd seen that look before, the cold, calculating stare of wealth protecting itself. But this time, there was something else lurking beneath the surface. Something that made her stomach twist with a familiar dread she'd spent decades trying to forget. Lauren paused at the wrought iron gates, turning back to look at the mansion that had been her workplace for the past 3 years. Gothic spires pierced the gray Seattle sky, and ivy crawled up the stone walls like ancient secrets refusing to stay buried. She'd always felt small in the shadow of this place, but today, she felt invisible. The accusation still burned in her mind. Poison. They'd actually accused her of trying to poison Edward Jackson, one of the most powerful men in the Pacific Northwest. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so terrifying. After everything she'd survived, everything she'd sacrificed to stay hidden, to end up here, falsely accused by the very family that had tried to destroy her once before. "Ma'am," the security guard's voice was gentler now that they were away from the prying eyes of the estate staff. "You need a ride somewhere." Lauren shook her head, not trusting her voice. She'd learned long ago that kindness from strangers was often more dangerous than cruelty. Besides, she had nowhere to go that these people couldn't find her if they really wanted to. As she walked down the tree-lined street, her fingers unconsciously went to the delicate chain around her neck. Hidden beneath her uniform, the small golden butterfly pendant had been her only companion through 26 years of exile. She'd never taken it off, not once. Even when wearing it meant risking everything. The memory hit her like a physical blow. Edward's face when he'd seen it. That moment when she'd bent to retrieve her fallen apron. And the chain had slipped out from beneath her collar. The way his breath had caught. The way his hand had frozen halfway to his coffee cup. For just an instant, she'd seen recognition flicker in those steel-gray eyes. The same eyes that had once looked at her with such tenderness. But that was impossible. Edward Jackson didn't know Lauren Mitchell existed. He'd never seen her face clearly in the 3 years she'd worked in his kitchen. Never looked twice at the quiet woman who prepared his meals and cleaned his home. She'd made sure of that, keeping her head down, her hair different, her whole appearance carefully altered. She wasn't Samantha Scott anymore. That girl had died 26 years ago in a rain-soaked alley, clutching her belly and running for her life. The bus ride to her small apartment in Capitol Hill passed in a blur of gray Seattle streets, and her own reflection in the window. She looked older than her 43 years. Worn down by decades of looking over her shoulder, of sleeping with one ear always listening for footsteps that might belong to the wrong people. Her apartment was a study in careful anonymity. Beige walls, generic furniture, nothing that would make anyone remember her if they came looking. She set the cardboard box on her small kitchen table and stared at it. Everything she'd built here, gone in an instant because someone had poisoned Edward Jackson's food and needed a scapegoat. But who and why frame her specifically? Lauren poured herself a glass of water with shaking hands. The Jackson estate employed dozens of people. Gardeners, housekeepers, drivers, cooks. She was just one of several women who worked in the kitchen, and certainly not the most visible. In fact, she'd gone out of her way to be unremarkable, to blend into the background unless... Her blood turned to ice as the pieces began falling into place. The way Vanessa Jackson had been watching her lately, asking pointed questions about her background, her previous employers, the subtle hostility that had replaced Vanessa's usual indifference, and those times she'd caught Edward's new wife studying her with calculating eyes, as if trying to solve a puzzle. Did Vanessa suspect something? Had she somehow connected Lauren Mitchell to Samantha Scott? The thought sent Lauren to her bedroom window, where she peered through the curtains at the street below. Everything looked normal. Evening joggers, dog walkers, the usual Capitol Hill crowd heading to dinner. But normalcy had been her enemy before. It was always in the quiet moments that danger struck. She pulled out her phone, her finger hovering over a number she hadn't called in months. Haley would be getting off work soon, probably heading home to her own apartment across town. Beautiful, brilliant Haley, who thought her parents had died in a car accident when she was a baby, who had no idea that her mother was alive and had been watching from the shadows for 25 years. Lauren's thumb hovered over the call button, then pulled back. What would she say? How could she explain that the mother Haley had never known was suddenly unemployed and possibly in danger, all because of a family that Haley worked for without knowing they'd once tried to kill her own mother? The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. Haley Jackson. Well, Haley thought her last name was Mitchell, after the woman who'd raised her. Worked as a legal consultant for Jackson Enterprises, her own daughter, unknowingly serving the family that had destroyed their lives. A knock at the door made Lauren's heart stop. 3 soft raps, then silence. She crept to the peephole, her mouth dry with fear. The hallway was empty, but a small envelope lay on the floor just outside her door. Lauren waited 10 full minutes before opening the door. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive, with her name written in elegant script. No return address. Inside was a single sentence written in the same careful handwriting. Some secrets refuse to stay buried, Samantha. The paper fluttered from her trembling fingers as 26 years of carefully constructed lies crumbled around her. Someone knew. After all this time, all her precautions, someone had found her. And if they'd found her, they could find Haley too. 26 years earlier, the summer of 1999 had been the kind that Seattle rarely saw. Endless blue skies and warm evenings that stretched until nearly 10 o'clock. Samantha Scott had just turned 17, and the world felt full of infinite possibilities as she walked through the gardens of the Jackson estate, her heart racing with the kind of reckless joy that only first love could bring. "Sam, over here," Edward's voice carried across the rose garden, and she turned to see him standing by the old oak tree where they'd shared their first kiss just 3 weeks ago. At 22, he was everything her strict Catholic school had warned her about. Older, wealthy, and completely off limits. But when he smiled at her like that, as if she were the only person in the world who mattered, every warning her mother had ever given her evaporated like morning mist. "I have something for you," he said, his gray eyes sparkling with mischief as she approached. His hands were hidden behind his back, and that boyish grin made her stomach flutter. "Edward, you know you don't have to. Close your eyes." His voice was soft, almost reverent, and she obeyed without question. She felt him step closer, felt the warmth of his breath against her neck as he fastened something delicate around her throat. "Okay, open them." Samantha's fingers went immediately to the necklace, tracing the outline of a small golden butterfly suspended from a strand of perfect pearls. "Edward, it's beautiful, but I can't." "You can, and you will." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she didn't realize had fallen. "The butterfly is for transformation, for new beginnings, and the pearls." He paused, his eyes growing serious. "Pearls are formed in darkness, Sam. Something beautiful created from irritation and pain, just like you." She'd known he was referring to her home life, the cramped apartment she shared with her alcoholic mother, the nights she spent working at the diner to pay for school supplies, the way she felt invisible most of the time. But Edward saw her, really saw her. "I love you," she whispered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I love you too, Samantha Scott. More than you could possibly know." That had been in July. By August, her period was 3 weeks late, and by September, her world had completely fallen apart. The pregnancy test had been positive, of course. She'd known even before she'd bought it from the pharmacy downtown, far from anyone who might recognize her. The morning sickness, the exhaustion, the way her body felt different, foreign. Somehow, she'd planned to tell Edward right away. They'd talked about the future, about him going away to college and her finishing high school, about somehow making it work, despite the 5-year age gap that felt like a lifetime. Surely he'd be surprised, maybe even scared, but he loved her. They'd figure it out together. But Margaret Jackson had found out first. Samantha still remembered every detail of that October afternoon, the way the light had slanted through the estate's tall windows, the smell of Martha's apple cinnamon bread, baking in the kitchen, the sound of her own heartbeat drowning out everything else as Edward's mother cornered her in the library. "I know what you are," Margaret had said, her voice cultured and cold as winter rain. She was 62 then, still beautiful in that brittle way of women who'd never known a day of real hardship. A little gold digger who thinks she can trap my son with a bastard child. Mrs. Jackson, don't. Margaret's manicured hand had cut through the air like a blade. I've had you investigated, dear. Your mother's drinking problem, your family's debts, that pathetic little apartment you call home. Did you really think Edward would choose that over his inheritance? Samantha's hand had gone instinctively to her belly, still flat but somehow precious in a way she couldn't articulate. Edward loves me. Edward is 22 years old and thinks with his dick, just like every other man his age. Margaret's crude language had been shocking coming from her refined lips. But he'll get over it. They always do. You can't stop us from... Can I? Margaret had smiled then, and it was the most terrifying expression Samantha had ever seen. You have no idea what I'm capable of, little girl. What I've already done to protect this family. The threat had been clear, even if the specifics weren't. But Margaret hadn't been content with mere intimidation. The men had come for her 3 nights later. Samantha had been walking home from her job at the diner, cutting through the alley behind the church like she did every night, when she'd heard footsteps behind her. Heavy, deliberate, getting closer. She'd started to run, but they'd been faster, stronger. The first man had grabbed her arm with a grip that left bruises for weeks, while the second had pressed something sharp against her ribs. Mrs. Jackson sends her regards, one of them had said, his breath hot and sour against her ear. Seems like you didn't get the message the first time. They would have killed her. She was certain of that. Even 26 years later, would have made it look like a robbery gone wrong. Another tragic statistic in the city's crime reports. But Martha had saved her. Martha Williams, the Jackson estate's head housekeeper for 30 years, had been like a mother to every member of the staff. She'd noticed Samantha's growing panic over the past few days, had seen the way the girl jumped at shadows and flinched at unexpected sounds. Run, baby, Martha had whispered, appearing in the alley like an angel of mercy. She'd been coming home from her own evening shift when she'd spotted the men following Samantha. There's a car waiting at the end of the block. Blue Honda, license plate starts with jam. The driver will take you somewhere safe. But you have to go now. Martha, I can't just... You can and you will. There's no time to explain. But Margaret Jackson wants you dead, child. You and that baby you're carrying. The next few hours had passed in a blur of terror and desperate planning. Martha had connections. Friends who asked no questions. People who understood that sometimes good folks needed to disappear for bad reasons. By dawn, Samantha Scott was dead, at least on paper, and Lauren Mitchell was born. The documents were crude by modern standards, but they'd passed inspection in 1999. A birth certificate, a social security card, even a high school transcript from a small town in Montana that no one would bother to verify. Martha had given her an envelope containing $5,000 in cash, money she'd been saving for her own retirement, sacrificed without hesitation to save a girl she'd known for less than 6 months. You write to me when the baby comes, Martha had said, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as they'd said goodbye at a Greyhound station 300 miles from Seattle. Let me know you're both safe. That's all I need. And Samantha had written, every month for 25 years, long letters filled with updates about Haley's first steps. Her first words, her first day of school. Martha had written back religiously, sharing news from the estate, carefully coded updates about Edward's life, his marriage to Vanessa, his success with the family business. Never once had Martha mentioned that Margaret Jackson was still looking for them, that the old woman's hatred had never dimmed, never softened with age. That had been Samantha's mistake, assuming the danger had passed with time. Now, sitting in her small apartment with that threatening note clutched in her trembling hands, she finally understood the truth. Margaret Jackson had never stopped hunting. She'd simply been patient, waiting for the right moment to strike. And somehow, impossibly, that moment had finally come. Present day, the life Lauren had built for herself and Haley had been constructed on a foundation of carefully maintained lies, each one designed to keep them both safe from the shadows of the past. For 25 years, she'd been the perfect invisible woman, working in the kitchens of wealthy families, always reliable, never memorable, moving from household to household with references that were genuine but deliberately sparse. Haley had grown up believing her parents died in a car accident when she was 6 months old. raised by Martha Williams until the woman's death 3 years ago. It was a simple story, tragic enough to discourage too many questions, believable enough to pass casual scrutiny. What Haley didn't know was that Lauren had been there all along, watching from the shadows, sending money through Martha, making sure her daughter had everything she needed without ever being able to hold her. The hardest part hadn't been the separation, though that had nearly killed her 1,000 times over. The hardest part had been watching Haley grow into a brilliant, beautiful woman who carried herself with the kind of quiet confidence that Lauren had never possessed at that age. Haley had Edward's eyes and his stubborn determination, but she'd inherited something else too, a moral compass that pointed true north no matter what storms raged around her. That moral compass had led her straight into the belly of the beast, 15 blocks across town. Haley Jackson. The name felt like betrayal every time Lauren thought it. Was working late in her corner office at Patterson and Associates, one of Seattle's most prestigious law firms. At 25, she was the youngest associate the firm had ever hired, and she'd earned her position through sheer brilliance and an almost supernatural ability to see through legal complexity to the heart of any issue. She had no idea that her current client was her own father. "These numbers don't add up," Haley muttered, pushing her dark-rimmed glasses up her nose as she studied the financial documents spread across her desk. Benjamin Jackson had asked her to review his family's corporate structure for potential tax optimization, but the more she dug into the paperwork, the more inconsistencies she found. Benjamin knocked on her office door, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the expensive machine down the hall. "Burning the midnight oil again. Your family's finances are more complicated than quantum physics," she said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "How did your grandfather structure some of these trusts? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like someone's been moving money around in ways that would make the IRS very interested." Benjamin settled into the chair across from her desk, his expression growing serious. At 28, he was everything his father had been at that age. Intelligent, driven and blessed with the kind of natural charisma that made people want to trust him. But where Edward had inherited his mother's calculating coldness, Benjamin had somehow developed a genuine warmth that set him apart from the rest of the Jackson clan. "That's exactly what I was afraid you'd say," he admitted. "I've been suspicious for months, but I needed someone with your expertise to confirm it." "Suspicious of what, exactly?" Benjamin was quiet for a long moment, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the Seattle skyline. "My mother. I think she's been embezzling from the family trust." Haley felt her stomach tighten. Financial crimes were serious business, especially when they involved amounts like the ones they were discussing. "Benjamin, that's a huge accusation. Are you sure you want to go down this road?" "I've been sure since I found the second set of books." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a flash drive. "Everything's on here, transactions going back 5 years, shell companies, offshore accounts, the whole 9 yards. As Haley plugged the drive into her computer, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was opening a door that could never be closed again. The files that populated her screen told a story of systematic theft, carefully disguised but ultimately traceable to someone with intimate knowledge of the Jackson family's financial structure. "Jesus, Benjamin, this is..." She scrolled through page after page of damning evidence. "This is millions of dollars. Try tens of millions." His voice was flat, emotionless. "And that's just what I've found so far. Why come to me? Your family has an army of lawyers on retainer." Benjamin's laugh was bitter. "Because half of them are probably in on it, and the other half report directly to my mother. You're the only person I trust to handle this objectively." The word trust hit Haley harder than it should have. In the 6 months they'd been working together, she and Benjamin had developed something that went beyond the typical attorney-client relationship. There was an easy camaraderie between them, a shared sense of humor and similar values that made their professional collaboration feel effortless. She'd be lying if she said she hadn't noticed how his eyes crinkled when he smiled, or the way he always seemed to know exactly what she needed to hear when a case was getting the better of her. But mixing business with pleasure was a line she'd never crossed, and she wasn't about to start now, especially not with a client whose family finances were apparently built on fraud. "I'll need to run this by my partners," she said finally. "A case this size, with these kinds of implications." "Haley," Benjamin's voice was soft, almost pleading. "I know I'm asking a lot, but my family, we're not all like my mother. Some of us actually believe in doing the right thing." Even when it's hard. She studied his face, looking for any sign of deception. But all she saw was sincerity and a kind of quiet desperation that made her chest ache. What about your father? Does he know? Dad's been in his own world lately. Ever since that incident with the cook yesterday. He's been acting strange, distracted, like he's seen a ghost or something. Haley's fingers stilled on the keyboard. What incident with the cook? Some woman named Lauren got fired for allegedly poisoning his food. Ridiculous, if you ask me. Lauren seemed harmless enough the few times I saw her, but Dad went ballistic, had security escort her out immediately. Benjamin shook his head. Mom was practically gleeful about the whole thing. Said it was about time they got rid of the dead weight on the household staff. The coffee in Haley's stomach turned to acid. She'd heard the name Lauren mentioned around the house a few times when she'd visited for business meetings, always in passing, always as just another member of the help. But something about Benjamin's description made her skin crawl. Did you say Lauren? She asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Lauren Mitchell, I think. Why? Haley's world tilted sideways. Mitchell, the same last name as the woman who'd raised her, the woman she'd always believed was some distant relative of her parents. But Martha Williams had been a Jackson family employee, and now there was another woman with the surname Mitchell working for the same family. That couldn't be a coincidence. No reason, she lied, her mind racing. Just, that's my mother's maiden name. Small world. But even as she said it, Haley knew it was more than coincidence. The pieces were all there. She just couldn't see the picture they formed yet. Martha Williams, the woman who'd raised her, had worked for the Jackson family for 30 years. A cook named Lauren Mitchell had just been fired under suspicious circumstances, and now Benjamin was asking her to investigate his family's finances, trusting her with secrets that could destroy them all. Benjamin, she said slowly, I need you to tell me everything you know about this Lauren woman. And I mean everything. He looked surprised by the intensity in her voice. Why? You think she's connected to the embezzlement somehow? I don't know what I think yet, but I have a feeling that your family's problems are a lot more complicated than stolen money. As Benjamin began to recount what little he knew about Lauren Mitchell, Haley felt the careful architecture of her life beginning to crack. 25 years of believing she knew who she was, where she came from, what her story meant. All of it suddenly felt as fragile as spun glass, and somewhere deep in her bones, she knew that once the truth came out, nothing would ever be the same again. 2 days earlier, Vanessa Jackson stood in her walk-in closet, surrounded by thousands of dollars worth of designer clothing, and felt the familiar taste of fear creeping up her throat. At 40, she'd perfected the art of appearing serene while her mind calculated every possible threat to her carefully constructed life. And lately, those threats seemed to be multiplying. She'd married Edward Jackson 5 years ago, not for love, though she'd convinced herself that might develop with time, but for security. After growing up in a middle-class family that had lost everything in the 2008 financial crisis, watching her father drink himself to death, and her mother work 3 jobs just to keep their house, Vanessa had sworn she'd never be vulnerable again. Edward had been the perfect solution. Wealthy, recently divorced and still nursing wounds from his first marriage that had ended badly. He'd needed someone sophisticated, someone who understood the social obligations that came with his position. She'd needed financial security and the kind of status that would ensure she'd never have to worry about money again. It had been a transaction, clean and simple. Until recently, the problem had started 3 months ago, when she'd walked into Edward's study unexpectedly and found him staring at an old photograph. When he'd noticed her, he'd quickly shoved it into a desk drawer, but not before she'd caught a glimpse of a young woman with dark hair and laughing eyes, wearing what looked like a 1990s prom dress. Who was that? She'd asked, trying to sound casual. Nobody important, he'd replied, but his voice had carried a weight that made her stomach clench. Just someone from a long time ago. That night, she'd waited until Edward was asleep before searching his study. The photograph had been easy to find. He'd hidden it in the same drawer where he kept his father's old watch and his college ring, items that held sentimental value. The back of the photo had been inscribed in youthful handwriting. Edward and Samantha, summer 1999, love always, S. Samantha, the name had hit Vanessa like a physical blow. She'd heard that name whispered in the dark corners of Jackson family history, always in hushed tones, usually followed by Margaret Jackson's pursed lips and Edward's sudden silence. The girl who'd disappeared when Edward was in college. The one who'd caused problems for the family. The reason Margaret had been so insistent that Edward marry someone appropriate when he'd finally decided to settle down. Vanessa had hired a private investigator within the week. What he'd uncovered had shattered any illusion she'd had about her marriage being stable. Edward had been searching for Samantha Scott for over 2 decades. He'd employed investigators, maintained contacts with missing persons organizations, even donated money to charities that helped runaway teens, all in the hope that somehow, someday, he might find the girl who'd vanished from his life without explanation. The girl he'd clearly never stopped loving. But it was what the investigator had discovered about Samantha's disappearance that had truly terrified Vanessa. Margaret Jackson hadn't just disapproved of her son's teenage romance. She'd actively worked to destroy it. There were records of payments to private security firms, mysterious accidents that had befallen people who'd asked too many questions about Samantha's whereabouts, and most damning of all, a death certificate that had been filed and then mysteriously withdrawn within 24 hours. Margaret Jackson was capable of murder, and if she'd been willing to kill to protect the family's interests once, she'd certainly be willing to do it again. That knowledge had given Vanessa nightmares for weeks, until she'd realized it also gave her power. The confrontation with Margaret had taken place in the old woman's private sitting room, surrounded by portraits of dead Jackson patriarchs who seemed to watch disapprovingly from their gilded frames. "I know what you did to Samantha Scott," Vanessa had said without preamble. Margaret hadn't even looked up from her needlepoint. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, dear. The investigators you hired, the accidents that happened to people who got too close to the truth, the death certificate that was filed and then pulled." Vanessa had placed copies of the documents on the side table next to Margaret's chair. "I know everything." That had gotten the old woman's attention. Margaret had set down her needlework and studied Vanessa with eyes that were sharp as glass despite her 78 years. "And what exactly do you plan to do with this information?" "That depends on you." Vanessa had kept her voice steady, professional, like she was negotiating a business deal. "Edward is still looking for her. If he ever finds out what really happened, he won't." Margaret's voice had been flat. "Certain, because she's dead, just like I planned. I made sure of that years ago." The casual admission had made Vanessa's blood run cold, but she'd pressed on. "Are you sure about that? Because if she's alive, if she ever comes back, she won't." But for the first time, Margaret had sounded less certain. She wouldn't dare. That conversation had been 6 weeks ago. Since then, Vanessa had watched Margaret become increasingly paranoid, constantly checking the household staff, asking pointed questions about new employees, even having background checks run on people who'd worked for the family for years. It was Margaret's paranoia that had led to Lauren Mitchell becoming a problem. Vanessa had noticed Lauren before Margaret's suspicions had been aroused. She made it her business to notice everything that happened in the Jackson household. Lauren was quiet, efficient, and almost invisible in the way that good domestic help should be. But there had been something about her that nagged at Vanessa, something familiar that she couldn't quite place. When Margaret had started asking questions about Lauren's background, Vanessa had done her own investigating. What she'd found had been frustratingly sparse. Lauren Mitchell had appeared in the employment records of wealthy Seattle families about 3 years ago, with references that checked out, but a personal history that was oddly thin for a woman in her 40s. But it was the way Edward had started acting around Lauren that had really set off alarm bells. He'd never interacted with her directly. Vanessa made sure of that. But she'd caught him watching the kitchen sometimes, his expression thoughtful in a way that made her stomach twist with jealousy. The final straw had come 2 weeks ago, when Vanessa had walked into the dining room to find Edward staring at nothing, his coffee growing cold, while the sound of Lauren's voice drifted from the kitchen as she spoke to one of the other staff members. "She sounds familiar," he'd murmured, more to himself than to her. That night, Vanessa had made her decision. Whether Lauren Mitchell was Samantha Scott or not, she was a threat that needed to be eliminated. And if Margaret Jackson had taught her anything, it was that sometimes the most effective way to eliminate a threat was to make it eliminate itself. The poison had been Margaret's idea. Actually, Vanessa had gone to the old woman with her concerns about Lauren, and Margaret had listened with the calculating expression she wore when solving particularly complex problems. "We need her gone," Margaret had said simply, "permanently. I can't just fire her. Edward might ask questions. Then we make sure she fires herself. Margaret's smile had been cold as winter rain. A few drops of ricin in Edward's morning coffee should do the trick. Just enough to make him sick. Not enough to kill him. Lauren will be the obvious suspect. She prepares all his meals. Once she's arrested, she'll disappear into the system. And even if she is who we think she might be, she'll never be able to prove it from a prison cell. The plan had been elegant in its simplicity. Vanessa had access to Margaret's private medicine cabinet, where the old woman kept a variety of substances that she'd acquired over the years for emergencies. The ricin had been easy to obtain. Margaret had connections that didn't ask inconvenient questions. Vanessa had added it to Edward's coffee Tuesday morning. Just a few drops stirred into the cream before Lauren brought the tray to his study. Within an hour, Edward had been violently ill, and by afternoon, the entire household was in chaos as doctors were called and accusations flew. Lauren's termination had been swift and brutal. Exactly as planned, security had escorted her out before she could protest her innocence or demand an investigation. The whole thing had been wrapped up neatly, with no loose ends or inconvenient questions, except now, standing in her closet with that threatening note in her hands, Vanessa realized she might have made a terrible mistake. Because if Lauren Mitchell really was Samantha Scott, then firing her had just freed the one person who could destroy everything the Jackson family had built. And worse, it had given her a reason to want revenge. Edward Jackson had always prided himself on his memory. In business, the ability to recall details, a competitor's tell during negotiations, the exact wording of a contract clause, the subtle shift in a client's body language, had made him millions. But for the past 3 days, ever since Lauren Mitchell had been escorted from his estate, his perfect recall had become a curse. The necklace haunted him, that delicate chain of pearls with its golden butterfly pendant. Glimpsed for just a moment when she'd bent to retrieve her fallen apron, the image played on repeat in his mind like a broken film reel, each viewing revealing new details that made his chest tight with impossible hope. He'd given that necklace to only one person in his life, Samantha Scott, the girl who'd disappeared without a trace 26 years ago, taking his heart and his unborn child with her. But Lauren Mitchell couldn't be Samantha, could she? Thursday evening found Edward sitting in his Bentley outside a modest apartment building in Capitol Hill, feeling like a stalker. He'd gotten Lauren's address from the household records, information that any reasonable employer would have. He told himself he wasn't crossing a line. He was just satisfying his curiosity. The building was old but well-maintained, the kind of place where young professionals and aging artists live side by side in comfortable anonymity. Nothing like the mansion where Samantha had grown up dreaming of escape. But nothing like the run-down tenements where she'd feared she'd end up either. Edward checked his watch. 7:15. If Lauren followed the same patterns as most working people, she'd be coming home from whatever job she'd managed to find since Tuesday. He'd wait until 8, he told himself. If she didn't show by then, he'd leave and forget this whole ridiculous notion. At 7:23, she appeared at the end of the block, walking slowly with the careful gait of someone who'd learned to conserve energy for the battles that mattered. She was carrying a bag from the grocery store and wearing a coat that had seen better years. But there was something in the way she held herself, a quiet dignity that no amount of hardship could touch, that made Edward's breath catch in his throat. He knew that walk, knew the way she tilted her head slightly to the left when she was thinking, knew the exact rhythm of her steps. Jesus Christ. It's really her. Edward was out of the car before conscious thought caught up with action, crossing the street with long strides that ate up the distance between them. Samantha. She froze mid-step, her back still turned to him, and for a moment he thought she might run. But then her shoulders straightened, and she turned around with the kind of quiet resignation that comes from knowing a reckoning has been postponed long enough. "Hello, Edward?" Her voice was different, rougher around the edges, worn smooth by years of careful modulation. But it was still the voice that had whispered "I love you" in the darkness of his father's garden all those years ago. The voice that had haunted his dreams for 26 years. "I thought you were dead." The words came out as an accusation, raw with pain that time hadn't dulled. "I looked for you everywhere. I hired investigators. I never stopped." "I know." Her dark eyes were steady on his face, and he could see the girl she'd been buried deep beneath the woman she'd become. I know you looked for me. I'm sorry." "Sorry." The word exploded out of him with enough force to make an elderly woman walking her dog glance over nervously. "You're sorry, Samantha. You were pregnant. I thought we were going to... We need to talk," she said quietly, glancing around at the other pedestrians who were beginning to stare. "But not here. Not like this." Edward nodded, suddenly aware that he was making a scene on a public street. "My car?" "No." Her refusal was immediate and firm. "Your apartment is probably being watched. Mine too. Now, there's a coffee shop 2 blocks from here. Neutral ground." The fact that she was thinking about surveillance made his blood run cold. "Watched by who?" "Let's walk," she said instead of answering. "And Edward, call me Lauren. That's who I am now." The coffee shop was one of those deliberately quirky Seattle establishments that served fair trade everything and employed baristas with liberal arts degrees and facial piercings. Edward felt conspicuously overdressed in his tailored suit. But Lauren, he had to think of her as Lauren now, moved through the space like she belonged there. They found a table in the back corner, away from the evening crowd of laptop-wielding freelancers and first-date couples. Edward ordered a black coffee he didn't want. Lauren asked for chamomile tea with honey, the same thing she'd always ordered when they were young and money was tight. "Tell me," he said when the barista had retreated. "Tell me everything." So she did. The story came out in carefully controlled sentences, each revelation delivered with the kind of clinical detachment that Edward recognized as a coping mechanism. She told him about the pregnancy, about his mother's threats, about the men who'd come for her in the alley behind St. Mary's Church. "Martha saved my life," Lauren said, her hands wrapped around her tea mug like it was an anchor. She had friends, people who could make someone disappear when they needed to. New identity, new history. "I became Lauren Mitchell and Samantha Scott died in that alley. But the baby," Edward's voice cracked. "Our baby, Haley." For the first time since they'd sat down, Lauren's composure slipped, and he saw the raw love and pain that she'd been hiding. "Her name is Haley. She's 25 now, and she's beautiful, Edward. So beautiful and smart and good. She has your eyes." Edward felt like someone had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart until it burst. "Where is she? Is she safe? Does she know?" "She thinks her parents died in a car accident when she was a baby. Martha raised her, told her I was a distant relative who died young. It was the only way to keep her safe." Safe from what? But even as he asked the question, Edward knew the answer. His mother, Margaret Jackson, who'd proven 26 years ago that she was willing to kill to protect the family's interests. "Your mother never stopped looking for me," Lauren said quietly. "All these years she's had people watching, waiting. When Martha died 3 years ago, I thought maybe it was finally over, that enough time had passed. So I came back to Seattle and got a job working for my family." Edward's laugh was bitter. "Christ, Samantha. Lauren, do you have any idea how dangerous that was? I wanted to be close to Haley. She works for your company now. Did you know that? She's a lawyer, brilliant and determined, and she has no idea that the family she's helping has been the enemy her whole life." Lauren's voice broke slightly. "I just wanted to see her sometimes, to know she was okay. I never meant for any of this to happen." Edward reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Her skin was rougher now, marked by years of manual labor, but her touch still sent electricity shooting up his arm. "We have a daughter," he said wonderingly. "I have a daughter. Edward, you need to understand. This isn't a happy reunion. Your mother tried to have me killed once. She'll try again. And now that she knows I'm alive, she'll go after Haley too. Like hell she will." The words came out with enough venom to make Lauren flinch. "I won't let her hurt either of you." "Not again. You can't stop her. You don't know what she's capable of." "Then tell me." Edward's grip tightened on her hand. "Tell me everything she's done. Every crime she's committed. Every life she's destroyed. Because I'm done protecting a woman who tried to murder the mother of my child." Lauren studied his face for a long moment, and he could see her weighing her options, calculating risks and possibilities. Finally, she nodded. "There's more you need to know. About your father's death, about where your family's money really came from, about the empire you've inherited." "What about my father?" Lauren's eyes were infinitely sad as she met his gaze. "Your mother didn't just try to kill me, Edward. She succeeded with your father. He found out about the embezzlement, about what she was doing to the company finances. He was going to expose her. The coffee shop seemed to tilt around Edward as 20 years of carefully constructed memories crumbled. His father's sudden heart attack, his mother's convenient presence when it happened, the way she'd taken control of the company so quickly, so efficiently. She killed him. Martha heard them arguing the night he died, heard Margaret threaten him. The heart attack was too convenient, too perfectly timed. Lauren squeezed his hand. I'm sorry. I know how much you loved him. Edward sat in stunned silence, processing the fact that everything he'd believed about his life, his family, his inheritance, was built on murder and lies. But underneath the shock and grief, something else was growing, something that felt like rage but burned cleaner, brighter. What do we do? He asked. We run, tonight. We disappear and never look back. No. Edward's voice was steel. I'm done running. It's time my mother faced justice for what she's done. The Jackson estate felt different when Edward returned that night. The Gothic towers that had once represented strength and legacy now loomed like accusatory fingers against the Seattle sky. Every portrait lining the hallways seemed to mock him with their painted smiles. Generations of Jackson patriarchs who'd built their fortune on lies. He was only now beginning to understand. Margaret was in the library, as she always was after dinner, working on her needlepoint while classical music played softly from the vintage radio she'd inherited from her own mother. At 78, she remained formidable. Silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, posture straight, despite the wheelchair she'd been confined to since her stroke 2 years ago. She looked up when he entered, and he saw his own gray eyes reflected in her face, the same eyes he'd apparently passed down to the daughter he'd never known existed. Edward, darling, you're home late. Her voice carried that cultured warmth she'd perfected over decades of charity luncheons and society events. I was beginning to worry. Were you? He poured himself 3 fingers of scotch from the crystal decanter, his hands steadier than he'd expected. Funny, I wouldn't have thought you capable of worry, at least not about other people's well-being. Margaret's needle stilled against the fabric, but her expression remained serene. That's an odd thing to say. Have I done something to upset you? Samantha Scott. The name hung in the air between them like a blade. Does that ring any bells, Mother? For just a moment, so brief he almost missed it, fear flashed across Margaret's features. Then her mask slipped back into place, smooth as silk. I'm afraid I don't know what you mean, dear. Don't. Edward's voice cut through her pretense like a scalpel. Don't you dare lie to me. Not anymore. I know what you did to her. I know about the men you hired, the threats you made. I know you tried to have her killed. Margaret set down her needlepoint with deliberate care, arranging it on the side table, as if the conversation they were having was merely about dinner plans or the weather. That girl was going to destroy this family, she said finally, her voice matter of fact. You were 22 years old, Edward. A child yourself. Did you really think I was going to let some little gold digger trap you with a bastard pregnancy? The casual cruelty in her tone made Edward's vision blur with rage. She wasn't a gold digger. She was 17 years old, and she loved me. She was poor white trash who saw an opportunity. Margaret's voice never wavered from that maddeningly reasonable tone. Just like her alcoholic mother, looking for any excuse to leech off decent people, I saved you from making the biggest mistake of your life. You tried to murder a pregnant teenager. I did what I had to do to protect this family's interests. Margaret's eyes were cold as winter steel. And I'd do it again tomorrow if I had to. The admission hit Edward like a physical blow. He'd hoped, despite everything Lauren had told him, that there might be some explanation, some justification that would make his mother's actions seem less monstrous. But there was no remorse in her voice, no acknowledgement that what she'd done was wrong. She had our baby, he said quietly. I have a daughter, Mother, a 25-year-old daughter who's been alive all this time while you let me believe. Impossible. But Margaret's voice cracked slightly on the word. If she'd survived, I would have known. I had people watching, waiting. Your people missed her. She's been living under a different name, and she's been right here in Seattle for years. Edward moved closer to his mother's wheelchair, close enough to see the fear she was trying so hard to hide. In fact, you know her, Lauren Mitchell, the woman you had fired for poisoning my coffee. The color drained from Margaret's face so quickly, that for a moment Edward thought she might faint. That's not possible. Lauren Mitchell is she's nobody, a servant. She's the mother of my child, the woman I've been searching for since I was 22 years old, the woman you tried to have murdered in an alley 26 years ago. Edward knelt beside her wheelchair, his voice dropping to a whisper. And now I know what you're capable of. I have to wonder, what else have you done? What other lives have you destroyed to protect the precious Jackson legacy? Margaret's hands began to shake, the first sign of weakness Edward had ever seen from her. You don't understand the pressures I was under, the responsibilities. Tell me about my father. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Margaret went completely still, even her breathing seeming to stop. Your father died of a heart attack. You know that. Did he? Edward stood, towering over her wheelchair. Or did you help him along when he got too close to discovering what you'd been doing with the company finances? This time, Margaret couldn't hide her reaction. Her face crumpled as if he'd struck her, and when she spoke, her voice was barely audible. He was going to ruin everything. 40 years of building this empire, of securing our family's future, and he was going to throw it all away over some accounting irregularities. Accounting irregularities. Edward's laugh was harsh. Is that what you call embezzling millions of dollars from the family trust? I was protecting our interests. The investments your father wanted to make were risky, stupid. He would have lost everything our family had worked for generations to build. I did what I had to do. You murdered your own husband. I saved this family. Margaret's composure finally shattered, her voice rising to a near shriek. Everything you have, everything you are, is because I had the strength to make the hard choices. Your father was weak, just like you're being weak now, letting sentiment cloud your judgment. Edward stared at the woman who'd raised him, who'd read him bedtime stories and taught him to tie his shoes and kissed his scraped knees. The woman who'd apparently been a cold-blooded killer his entire life. How? The word came out as a croak. How did you do it? Margaret's smile was the most terrifying thing Edward had ever seen. Digitalis, a few drops in his morning coffee, just enough to trigger cardiac arrhythmia in a man who already had a weak heart. The beauty of plant-based toxins is that they're almost impossible to detect unless you know exactly what to look for. And the coroner didn't think to look. Why would he? Your father had a documented heart condition. I made sure of that. Years of carefully managed medical records. The right doctor willing to diagnose problems that weren't quite there. When he finally died, it was just the inevitable conclusion of a long illness. Edward felt sick, not just at the revelation of his father's murder, but at the cold calculation behind it. His mother hadn't killed in a moment of passion or desperation. She'd planned it meticulously, over years. You're a monster, he whispered. I'm a survivor, Margaret shot back. And I'm the reason you're not living in some trailer park married to a teenage mother who would have bled you dry. Everything you have is because I was strong enough to do what needed to be done. And Samantha, what about her? What were you planning to do if your hired killers had found her? Margaret's expression grew thoughtful, almost nostalgic. Oh, they did find her. Several times over the years. But she was always so careful, so good at disappearing just when they got close. I have to admit, I developed a grudging respect for her survival instincts. The admission sent ice through Edward's veins. You've been hunting her for 26 years. Hunting is such an ugly word. I prefer to think of it as monitoring a potential threat. Margaret smoothed an imaginary wrinkle from her skirt. But now that she's surfaced again, now that she's made contact with you, well, the game has changed. Hasn't it? What do you mean? Margaret's smile returned, and Edward realized with growing horror that despite everything he'd revealed, despite being caught in her lies and crimes, his mother still thought she held the winning hand. I mean, darling boy, that Samantha Scott, or Lauren Mitchell, or whatever she's calling herself these days, has just made the biggest mistake of her life. Because now I know exactly where she is. And more importantly, I know where to find her daughter. The threat was clear, and Edward felt his world tilt off its axis. You stay away from Haley. Haley. Margaret's eyebrows rose with genuine interest. What a pretty name. Martha chose well, yes. I know about Martha's role in all this. About how she helped that little bitch escape. I always wondered where the girl ended up. I won't let you hurt either of them. Oh, my dear boy, Margaret said, her voice soft with pity. You still don't understand, do you? You won't be able to stop me, because despite everything you think you know, despite all your moral outrage, you're still my son, and when push comes to shove, you'll protect the family name just like I taught you to. Edward stared at her for a long moment, seeing clearly for the first time the woman who'd shaped his entire life. Then he turned and walked toward the door. Where are you going? Margaret called after him. To call the police, Edward said without turning around. And then I'm going to find my daughter and tell her the truth about her family, all of it. Behind him, Margaret's laughter followed him into the hallway, cold and confident and utterly without remorse. Haley's apartment was a study in organized chaos. Law books stacked on every available surface, case files spread across her dining table, and empty coffee cups creating rings on her grandmother's antique side tables. She'd been working on Benjamin's case for 3 straight days, barely sleeping, surviving on takeout and determination. The financial records told a story that made her stomach turn. Vanessa Jackson hadn't just been embezzling. She'd been systematically looting the family trust for years, using a network of shell companies and offshore accounts that would have impressed the most creative tax attorney. But it was the timing of the thefts that really caught Haley's attention. The largest withdrawals had all occurred around the same dates as family tragedies, when Edward's father had died, when various family friends had suffered mysterious accidents, when employees had suddenly quit or disappeared. It was as if someone was being paid for services rendered, services that Haley didn't want to think about too closely. She was so absorbed in the documents that she almost didn't hear the soft knock at her door. When she looked up, it was nearly midnight, and she couldn't imagine who would be visiting at this hour. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Through the peephole, she saw a woman she didn't recognize, middle-aged, wearing an expensive coat that looked out of place in her bohemian neighborhood. The woman was holding what appeared to be a manila envelope and kept glancing over her shoulder as if she expected to be followed. Can I help you? Haley called through the door. Are you Haley Mitchell? The woman's voice was cultured, nervous. I have something that belongs to you. Something your grandmother wanted you to have. Haley's breath caught. Her grandmother, Martha Williams, had died 3 years ago, but she'd left behind a storage unit full of belongings that Haley had never had the heart to go through. She'd assumed everything important had already been sorted, against her better judgment. She opened the door, keeping the chain latch engaged. Who are you? My name is Patricia Chen. I was Martha's lawyer. The woman held up the envelope. She left specific instructions that if anything ever happened to a woman named Lauren Mitchell, I was to bring this to you immediately. She said you'd understand when the time came. Lauren Mitchell, the name that had been haunting Haley for days, ever since Benjamin had mentioned the cook who'd been fired from the Jackson estate. The name that was supposedly her mother's maiden name, but which had always felt like more than a coincidence. Haley unlatched the chain and opened the door fully. What kind of instructions? Patricia glanced around nervously before stepping inside. Martha was very specific. She said that if Lauren Mitchell was ever in danger, if she ever had to reveal her true identity, then it was time for you to know the truth about your family. What truth? But even as Haley asked the question, she felt the foundations of her carefully ordered world beginning to shift. Patricia handed her the envelope. She said to tell you that your mother isn't dead. She never was. And that everything you've been told about your family history is a lie designed to keep you safe. Haley's hands shook as she tore open the envelope. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, spanning what looked like 25 years, pictures of a young woman who looked exactly like Haley, holding a baby that could only be her, pictures of the same woman watching from a distance as a little girl played in a park, started school, graduated from high school, pictures of Lauren Mitchell at various ages, her appearance subtly different in each photo, but unmistakably the same person, pictures of her mother. I don't understand, Haley whispered, though part of her did understand, had been understanding for days without wanting to admit it. Patricia pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. Your grandmother loved you more than life itself, but the story she told you about your parents dying in a car accident, that was a lie. Your mother is alive, Haley. She's been alive this whole time, watching over you from a distance, making sure you were safe. Safe from what? From the Jackson family. From Margaret Jackson specifically. Patricia's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Your real name isn't Haley Mitchell, it's Haley Jackson. Your father is Edward Jackson, and your mother is Samantha Scott, the woman you know as Lauren Mitchell. The photographs scattered across the floor as Haley's hands went limp. That's impossible. Edward Jackson is my client. I've been working with his son Benjamin for months. If he was my father, wouldn't he? He doesn't know you exist. Your mother made sure of that to protect you both. Patricia reached into the envelope and pulled out a thick sheaf of papers. These are copies of the threats Margaret Jackson made against your mother when she found out about the pregnancy. These are records of the attempts on your mother's life. And these. She placed a final set of documents on the table, and Haley felt her world complete its collapse. These are medical records showing that your grandfather, Edward Jackson Sr., didn't die of natural causes. He was murdered by his own wife. Haley stared at the documents, her legal training automatically cataloging the evidence even as her emotional world exploded. Death certificates, toxicology reports that had been suppressed, witness statements that had never been filed with the police. It was a prosecutor's dream case, if it weren't 20 years too late. "Why are you telling me this now?" she managed to ask. "Because 3 days ago, Lauren Mitchell was fired from the Jackson estate under suspicious circumstances, and 12 hours ago, she met with Edward Jackson and told him the truth about who she is and who you are." Patricia's expression was grim. "Your mother is in danger, Haley. Real immediate danger. Margaret Jackson has spent 26 years trying to eliminate the threat your mother represents, and now that threat has just magnified exponentially." "What do you mean?" "Think about it from Margaret's perspective. Bad enough that her son's first love has resurfaced, but now Edward knows he has a daughter who's been working closely with his family's business, who has access to financial records, who might have already discovered the extent of Margaret's crimes." Patricia leaned forward. "You're not just a threat to Margaret Jackson's secrets anymore. You're a threat to her freedom, possibly her life." Haley's phone buzzed with a text message. Benjamin's name appeared on the screen. "Emergency. Can you meet me at the office? Found something about my mother you need to see." She showed the message to Patricia, who went pale. "Don't go alone. If Benjamin Jackson is reaching out now, it means the situation is escalating faster than we thought. He's not part of this," Haley said automatically. "Benjamin is one of the good ones. He's the one who asked me to investigate his mother's finances in the first place. That may be true, but he's still Margaret Jackson's grandson, and family loyalty runs deep in that bloodline." Patricia stood up, gathering the scattered photographs. "You need to call your mother. Warn her, and then you need to decide what you're going to do with the truth." After Patricia left, Haley sat alone in her apartment, surrounded by the debris of everything she'd believed about herself. The girl who'd grown up thinking she was an orphan was actually the daughter of one of Seattle's most powerful families. The woman she'd been told was a distant relative, who'd died young, was actually her mother, who'd spent 25 years sacrificing everything to keep her safe. And the family she'd been working for, the people she'd come to trust and respect, were the same people who'd tried to murder her mother and succeeded in murdering her grandfather. She picked up her phone to call Benjamin back, then hesitated. Patricia's warning echoed in her mind. How well did she really know Benjamin Jackson? How much of their friendship had been genuine? And how much had been carefully orchestrated by a family that had made deception and manipulation into art forms? But if she couldn't trust Benjamin, then who could she trust? Her mother was in hiding, possibly running for her life. Her father, God, Edward Jackson was her father, didn't even know she existed until 12 hours ago. And somewhere out there, Margaret Jackson was planning her next move in a game that had already lasted 26 years. Haley looked at her reflection in the black window of her apartment, seeing Edward Jackson's gray eyes staring back at her for the first time. Everything made sense now. The way she'd always felt comfortable in corporate boardrooms. The instinctive understanding of power dynamics that had served her so well as a lawyer. Even the way Benjamin had seemed to recognize something familiar in her from the moment they'd met. She was a Jackson, whether she wanted to be or not. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was an unknown number. Your mother is safe for now, but that won't last long. If you want to keep her alive, you'll do exactly what I tell you. No police, no Benjamin, no heroics. Just listen and obey. Haley stared at the message, her blood turning to ice. Then she did the one thing her legal training had taught her never to do without careful consideration. She deleted the message and called Benjamin anyway. The Jackson estate had become a fortress by midnight. Margaret Jackson sat in her wheelchair in the library, surrounded by the portraits of ancestors who seemed to judge her from their gilded frames. But she'd long since stopped caring about the opinions of the dead. What mattered now was survival. Hers. And the family legacy she'd spent 40 years building. Vanessa paced the room like a caged animal, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floor in a rhythm that made Margaret's teeth ache. The younger woman had been summoned an hour ago, arriving with the kind of barely controlled panic that Margaret found both irritating and useful. "This is all your fault," Vanessa hissed, stopping her pacing to glare at Margaret. "If you hadn't insisted on that ridiculous poisoning scheme, if you hadn't married my son for his money instead of loving him, we wouldn't be in this position at all," Margaret replied calmly. "Edward never would have gone looking for his lost love if he'd been truly happy in his marriage." Vanessa's face flushed red. "Don't you dare lecture me about marriage. You killed your own husband. I protected my family's interests, something you've apparently forgotten how to do." Margaret's voice carried the kind of quiet authority that had cowed boardrooms and charity committees for decades. "Now sit down and listen. Because we don't have much time." Reluctantly, Vanessa took the chair across from Margaret's wheelchair. "What's the plan?" "Simple. We eliminate the threat permanently this time." Margaret pulled a small device from her pocket, a GPS tracker that had been placed on Edward's car earlier that evening. "Edward is at Samantha's apartment right now. They're probably planning their next move, thinking they're safe because they've exposed my secrets. You had him followed. I've had him followed for 26 years, dear. The only reason I didn't kill that little bitch sooner was because I couldn't find her. But now she's made herself visible. And more importantly, she's given me leverage." Margaret rolled her wheelchair to the massive oak desk that had belonged to 3 generations of Jackson patriarchs and opened the bottom drawer. Inside, nestled among old business documents, was a leather case containing a vintage Colt .38 revolver. "This belonged to my father-in-law," she said, checking the cylinder with practiced ease. "He used it to settle business disputes back when the Jackson family fortune was being built. It seems fitting that it should be used to protect that fortune now." Vanessa stared at the gun with naked fear. "You can't be serious. Murder is one thing when it looks like an accident, but this will look like a robbery gone wrong. 2 lovers surprised by an intruder, both killed in the struggle. Very tragic, very believable." Margaret's smile was sharp as a blade. "Of course, you'll need to make sure there are no survivors to contradict that story." "Me?" Vanessa's voice rose to a near shriek. "You expect me to. I expect you to prove your loyalty to this family. Because if you don't, if you let sentiment or cowardice stop you from doing what needs to be done, then you'll be the next threat I have to eliminate." The threat hung in the air between them, and Vanessa seemed to physically shrink under the weight of it. Margaret had chosen her daughter-in-law carefully, beautiful enough to capture Edward's attention, intelligent enough to be useful, but weak enough to be controlled when necessary. "What about the daughter?" Vanessa asked quietly. "Haley, what about her? If we kill her parents, won't she become suspicious?" "She's a lawyer, Margaret. She knows how to investigate, how to ask uncomfortable questions." Margaret's expression grew thoughtful. "You raise a good point. We can't leave loose ends." She reached for the phone on her desk. "Fortunately, I have people who specialize in making problems disappear." The number she dialed belonged to a man she'd used for wet work before, a former military contractor who asked no questions and left no evidence. He answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Jackson, I was wondering when I'd hear from you again. I have a job for you, Marcus. 3 targets this time. Time sensitive." "I'm listening." Margaret gave him the addresses: Samantha's apartment, Haley's place across town, and the law office where Haley worked late most nights. "Make it look random. Street crime, burglary, whatever feels natural, but all 3 need to be handled tonight." "That's a lot of exposure, Mrs. Jackson. 3 hits in one night, all connected to your family, which is why you're being paid enough to retire to somewhere without extradition treaties." Margaret's voice was ice. $1 million, Marcus. Cash, for one night's work. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Margaret began to worry he might refuse. But when Marcus spoke again, his voice carried the resignation of a man who'd sold his soul so many times, that one more transaction hardly mattered. "Give me the details." While Margaret arranged for professional murder, Vanessa sat frozen in her chair, staring at nothing. She'd known when she married Edward that the Jackson family had secrets, but she'd never imagined the depths of Margaret's depravity, and now she was being dragged into it, made complicit in crimes that would destroy not just the people they were targeting, but her own soul. Having second thoughts, Margaret asked after hanging up the phone, "This is insane. Even if we kill them all tonight, Edward will know it was us. He'll never forgive. Edward will grieve, and then he'll move on. He always does." Margaret's voice carried a note of motherly affection that was somehow more terrifying than her threats. "He grieved for his father, didn't he? And he accepted my explanation about the heart attack. He'll accept whatever story we tell him about tonight's tragic events. But what if he doesn't? What if he goes to the police? Then we'll deal with that problem when it arises. But Edward is my son, Vanessa. He's been trained his entire life to protect the family name above all else. When push comes to shove, blood will tell." Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at the screen and smiled. Marcus is in position at the girl's apartment. He should be finished there within the hour. Vanessa felt bile rise in her throat. She's just a kid, Margaret. She doesn't deserve... She's a Jackson. That makes her dangerous by definition. Margaret's eyes were cold as winter steel. Besides, she's been investigating our finances, getting close to secrets that could destroy us all. Her death isn't just about eliminating Samantha's bloodline. It's about protecting ourselves. The library fell silent, except for the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. Vanessa found herself staring at that clock, watching the hands move inexorably toward the moment when 3 innocent people would die to protect the lies that had built the Jackson fortune. "There's something else you need to know," Margaret said quietly. "Something about Benjamin." Vanessa's head snapped up. "What about Benjamin?" "He's been asking questions about the finances, about certain irregularities in the family trust. I think he suspects something. Benjamin would never... Benjamin is his father's son. Idealistic, moralistic, convinced that doing the right thing is more important than protecting the family." Margaret's voice carried a note of deep sadness. "If he learns the truth about tonight, he'll try to stop us, which means he'll have to be stopped." The implication hit Vanessa like a physical blow. "You're talking about murdering your own grandson." "I'm talking about protecting the family legacy from internal threats, just like I've always done." Margaret's voice never wavered from that maddeningly reasonable tone. "Benjamin is a good boy, but he's weak, like his father, like his grandfather. Sometimes weakness has to be culled from the bloodline." Vanessa stood up so quickly that her chair toppled backward. "I won't be part of this. I won't help you murder Benjamin. You already are part of this," Margaret said calmly. "You poisoned my son's coffee. You helped frame Samantha for attempted murder. You're an accessory to conspiracy and attempted homicide. Do you really think you can walk away from this now?" The truth of those words hit Vanessa like a sledgehammer. She was trapped, caught in a web of crimes that had started with a simple desire to eliminate a romantic rival and had escalated into something that would destroy them all. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret smiled, and for the first time all evening, it was a genuinely warm expression. "I want you to call Benjamin. Tell him you found something urgent in the financial records, something that can't wait until morning. Ask him to meet you at the estate. And then we'll see if my grandson has the strength to do what's necessary to protect his family, or if he's just another weak link that needs to be broken." Benjamin Jackson had always trusted his instincts, and tonight they were screaming danger. The text from his stepmother asking him to come to the estate immediately had felt wrong from the moment he'd received it. Vanessa never worked late, never showed urgency about anything beyond her social calendar, and certainly never reached out to him directly about family business. But it was Haley's phone call that had really set his alarm bells ringing. Her voice had been strained, almost breathless, as she'd told him about Lauren Mitchell's true identity and the threats against her life. The woman he'd been falling in love with for months was apparently the daughter of the cook his family had just destroyed, and his own half-sister. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so terrifying. Now, driving through the empty Seattle streets toward the family estate, Benjamin tried to piece together the fragments of a conspiracy that seemed to grow more monstrous with each revelation. His grandmother was a murderer. His stepmother was an embezzler. His father had a secret daughter who'd been working under their noses for months, and somewhere in the middle of it all, 3 people were in immediate danger because they'd finally uncovered the truth. Benjamin pulled into the estate's circular driveway at 1:47 a.m., noting that most of the house was dark except for the library windows, his grandmother's sanctuary, where she held court like some ancient queen ruling over her diminishing kingdom. He let himself in through the front door, the same door he'd walked through as a child, coming home from school or summer camp, never imagining that the woman who'd baked him cookies and read him bedtime stories was capable of cold-blooded murder. The library door was slightly ajar, and he could hear voices from within. Vanessa's, high and nervous, his grandmother's, calm and commanding as always, and underneath their conversation, a sound that made his blood run cold, the distinctive click of a revolver's cylinder being checked. Benjamin pressed himself against the wall beside the door, listening. "Should be finished at the girl's apartment by now," Margaret was saying. "Marcus is very efficient." "This is insane," Vanessa replied, her voice cracking with strain. "Even if we kill them all, how do we explain—" "We don't explain anything. Tragic coincidence. 3 separate crimes on the same night, no connection to our family." Margaret's voice carried that reasonable tone she used when discussing charity events or investment strategies. "Edward will grieve, but he'll accept it. He always does." Benjamin felt his world tilt off its axis. They were talking about murder. Multiple murders. As casually as planning a dinner party. And from the context, it sounded like Haley was one of the targets. He pulled out his phone and fired off a quick text to Haley. "Don't go home. Don't go to office. Hide. Now." Then he switched the phone to silent and slipped it back into his pocket. "What about Benjamin?" Vanessa was asking. "If he finds out, Benjamin will do what's best for the family," Margaret replied. "He always has." Benjamin almost laughed at the bitter irony. His grandmother was right. He had always put family first, but she'd made one crucial miscalculation. She thought family meant protecting the Jackson name and fortune at any cost. For Benjamin, family meant protecting the people you loved from those who would hurt them. And right now, that meant protecting Haley from his own blood relatives. He pushed the library door open and stepped inside, his hands raised peacefully. "Hello, grandmother, Vanessa." Both women spun toward him, and Benjamin saw his grandmother's hand move instinctively toward something in her lap. The gun, probably, even at 78, and confined to a wheelchair. Margaret Jackson was still the most dangerous person in the room. "Benjamin, darling." Margaret's face lit up with genuine pleasure, as if finding him eavesdropping on their murder plans was a delightful surprise. "How wonderful that you're here. We were just discussing some family business." "I heard." Benjamin moved slowly into the room, keeping his distance from both women. "Sounds like you've been busy tonight. Multiple homicides, professional assassins, elaborate cover-ups. Very impressive for a woman your age." Margaret's smile never wavered. "You always were too smart for your own good, just like your grandfather. The grandfather you murdered. The grandfather who was going to destroy everything our family had worked to build." "Yes." Margaret's voice carried no hint of remorse. "Sometimes family requires sacrifice, Benjamin. I thought you understood that." Benjamin felt a laugh bubble up from somewhere deep in his chest. Not humor, but the kind of hysteria that comes from watching everything you've believed in crumble around you. "You're right. Family does require sacrifice." He took another step closer, and now he could see the antique revolver resting in Margaret's lap. "The question is, who's willing to make it? Don't be dramatic, dear. You're going to help us clean up this mess, just like you've always helped clean up family problems. Because at the end of the day, blood is thicker than water." "You're wrong about that," Benjamin said quietly. "I've learned something important recently. Family isn't about blood. It's about choosing to protect the people who matter to you, even when it cost you everything." He pulled out his phone and held it up so they could see the screen. "I've been recording this conversation for the past 5 minutes. Everything you've said about the murders, about Marcus, about tonight's plans. It's all here, and it's already been uploaded to the cloud." The change in Margaret's expression was subtle but unmistakable. The warm grandmother mask slipped away, revealing the cold calculation underneath. "You little fool," she said softly. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? I've stopped you from murdering 3 innocent people." Benjamin backed toward the door, his phone still recording. "It's over, grandmother. The police will be here soon." But Margaret was already moving, her wheelchair spinning toward him with surprising speed. The gun was in her hand now, no longer hidden, and Benjamin realized with crystal clarity that she was going to shoot him. Time seemed to slow as she raised the weapon. Benjamin could see her finger tightening on the trigger, could see Vanessa's mouth opening in a scream of protest, could feel his own muscles coiling to dive for cover. But before Margaret could fire, the library door burst open, and Edward Jackson stepped into the room, followed closely by Lauren, Samantha, and Haley. "Mother, stop!" Edward's voice cracked like a whip across the room. The distraction was all Benjamin needed. He lunged forward, not away from his grandmother, but toward her, his hands reaching for the gun. The revolver discharged with a sound like thunder in the enclosed space, the bullet splintering wood paneling inches from Haley's head. Benjamin's hands closed over the weapon, wrestling it away from Margaret's surprisingly strong grip. But she wasn't finished fighting. Her free hand clawed at his face, her nails drawing blood, while she screamed with rage that was more animal than human. "You've destroyed everything," she shrieked. 40 years of building this empire, and you've destroyed it all for some worthless girl." "She's not worthless," Benjamin gasped, finally wrenching the gun away. "She's my sister, and she's worth more than all your blood money combined." The words hung in the air like a benediction. Benjamin looked across the room at Haley, seeing his own gray eyes reflected in her face, seeing the same stubborn determination that had driven him to risk everything for what was right. "Hello, sister," he said, managing a shaky smile despite the blood running down his cheek. But Margaret wasn't finished. With the last of her strength, she lunged from her wheelchair toward Haley, her hands reaching for the younger woman's throat with murderous intent. Benjamin didn't think. He simply moved, throwing himself between his grandmother and the sister he'd just discovered. Margaret's momentum carried them both toward the massive stone fireplace, and Benjamin felt something give way in his chest as they collided with the hearth. Pain exploded through his torso. White-hot and all-consuming, he looked down to see the ornate letter opener from his grandmother's desk, protruding from between his ribs. Margaret's hand still wrapped around the handle. "Benjamin!" Haley's scream seemed to come from very far away. He collapsed to his knees, his vision graying at the edges. Margaret lay beside him, her face twisted with fury, even as her own life ebbed away. The impact with the fireplace had been too much for her elderly body. Strong hands, Edward's hands, caught Benjamin before he could fall completely. His father's face swam into focus, tears streaming down cheeks that Benjamin had never seen wet before. "Dad," the word came out as barely a whisper. "Don't talk. Save your strength. The ambulance is coming." But Benjamin could feel his life draining away with each heartbeat. The letter opener had found something vital, something that couldn't be repaired. He turned his head and saw Haley kneeling beside him, her legal composure completely shattered. "Take care of her," he whispered to Edward. "Take care of them both. They're the best of us." His vision was fading now, but he could still see Haley's face. Beautiful, brilliant Haley, who'd brought light into his world just in time for him to lose it. "I'm sorry we didn't have more time," he managed to say. And then the darkness claimed him, and Benjamin Jackson died, knowing that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go. 6 months later, the small chapel overlooking Elliott Bay was nothing like the grand cathedral where Margaret Jackson had always insisted family weddings should take place. Instead of Gothic spires and stained glass windows depicting long-dead saints, this venue offered floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the Seattle skyline and let natural light pour across simple wooden pews. Samantha Scott, she'd legally reclaimed her birth name after 26 years of hiding, stood at the altar in a cream-colored dress that Haley had helped her choose. At 43, she'd finally stopped looking over her shoulder, stopped expecting Margaret Jackson's shadow to fall across her path. The old woman was dead, her crimes exposed, her reign of terror finally ended, but the victory had come at a price that would haunt them all forever. Edward stood beside her, his gray hair touched with silver at the temples, wearing the same expression of quiet amazement that had become his default since learning he had a daughter. 6 months of getting to know Haley had transformed him from a distant businessman into something approximating a real father. Clumsy sometimes, overly protective often, but genuine in his love for the family he'd never known he'd lost. In the front pew, Haley sat with tears streaming down her face. Though whether they were tears of joy or grief was impossible to say. She wore a navy blue dress that Benjamin had once complimented, and a small butterfly pin that Samantha had given her, the same design as the pendant that had started this whole story. The minister was speaking about love that endures beyond time and hardship, about families that find their way back to each other despite impossible odds. But Haley found herself thinking about a different kind of love, the kind that sacrifices everything for someone else's safety, the kind that dies so others might live. Benjamin should have been here. He should have been Edward's best man. Should have been the one to walk his newfound sister down the aisle if she ever got married. Instead, there was only an empty space where his laughter should have been, a hole in their newly formed family that would never be filled. Do you, Edward Jackson, take Samantha Scott to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. Edward's voice was steady. Certain, for better or worse, in sickness and health, for as long as we both shall live. It was the same vow he'd made silently, 26 years ago in his father's garden, when he'd given a 17-year-old girl a necklace and promised to love her forever. Some promises, Haley realized, were worth keeping even when the world conspired against them. Do you, Samantha Scott, take Edward Jackson to be your lawfully wedded husband? Samantha's answer came out as barely more than a whisper, but it carried the weight of decades of separation, of sacrifice, of love that had somehow survived everything Margaret Jackson had done to destroy it. I do. The kiss that followed was gentle, almost hesitant, as if both of them were afraid that sudden movements might shatter the fragile happiness they'd found. But when they broke apart, they were smiling through their tears, and for a moment, Haley could see the young couple they'd once been, full of hope and plans for a future that had taken 26 years to materialize. The reception was held at Edward's house, not the Jackson estate, which had been sold to developers who planned to turn it into luxury condominiums, but a smaller place on Queen Anne Hill that felt like a home, rather than a monument to inherited wealth. The guest list was deliberately small, a few of Edward's business associates who'd become genuine friends over the years, some of Haley's colleagues from the law firm, and Martha Williams' surviving relatives, who'd flown in from across the country to celebrate the woman they'd helped save. Haley stood on the deck overlooking the Sound, nursing a glass of champagne she didn't really want, and watching seaplanes take off from Lake Union. The setting sun painted the water gold, and she found herself remembering another evening 6 months ago when everything had changed forever. Penny for your thoughts. She turned to find her father. God, it still felt strange to think of Edward Jackson as her father, approaching with 2 pieces of wedding cake. He handed her one and settled beside her on the deck railing. Just thinking about Benjamin, she said honestly, wondering what he'd think of all this. Edward was quiet for a long moment, his own gaze focused on the water. He'd be happy for us, and proud of you. You've honored his memory by choosing to build something good out of all the pain. He was referring to the Hope House, the nonprofit organization Haley had established with her inheritance from Margaret Jackson's estate. After all the legal proceedings had concluded, after Vanessa had been sentenced to 15 years for embezzlement and conspiracy, there had been a substantial settlement from the family trust. Haley had used every penny to create a sanctuary for runaway teenagers and young mothers, girls like her mother had been, trapped by circumstances and in need of someone to believe in their potential. I keep thinking about the letter opener, Haley admitted. How it could have been me instead of him if he hadn't. Don't. Edward's voice was firm but gentle. Benjamin made his choice, and it was the right choice. He saved you because you were worth saving, because you had a whole life ahead of you to live. Don't dishonor that sacrifice by wishing it had been different. From inside the house came the sound of laughter, Samantha telling some story about her years in hiding that had become funnier with time and distance. It was a sound that Haley was still getting used to. This evidence that her mother was capable of joy despite everything she'd endured. Are you happy? Edward asked suddenly. Really happy. Because I know this isn't the life you planned for yourself. Finding out your whole family history was a lie. Discovering that your mother was alive. Learning that the people you were working for were... I'm happy, Haley interrupted, and realized as she said it, that it was true. It's not the life I planned, but it's the life I was meant to have. Even the painful parts. Especially the painful parts. She pulled the butterfly pin from her dress and held it up to catch the last rays of sunlight. Benjamin told me once that butterflies are symbols of transformation, that they have to completely destroy their old selves to become something beautiful. Sounds like something he'd say. I think that's what happened to us. We had to lose everything we thought we knew about ourselves to discover who we really were. Mom had to stop being Lauren Mitchell to become Samantha Scott again. You had to stop being Margaret's son to become my father, and I had to stop being an orphan to become part of a family. Edward reached over and squeezed her hand. Your mother was right to be proud of you. You're stronger than either of us ever were. I learned from the best teachers, Haley replied. A mother who gave up everything to keep me safe, and a brother who gave up his life to save mine. They stood in comfortable silence as the sun finished setting over Elliott Bay, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Inside the house, Samantha was laughing again, and the sound carried on the evening breeze like a promise that some stories, despite their tragic elements, could still have happy endings. The next morning would bring new challenges. The Hope House was expanding to 3 new cities. Edward was restructuring his business empire to focus on ethical investments, and Haley was considering a move to family law where she could help other people untangle the complicated knots of their histories. But tonight was for celebration, for the miracle of a family that had found its way back together against impossible odds. Tonight was for remembering that love, real love, endures beyond death and time, and the worst that human nature can inflict. And in the end, perhaps that was the most important lesson Benjamin Jackson had taught them, that the greatest acts of love are often measured not in what we gain, but in what we're willing to sacrifice for the people who matter most. The golden butterfly pendant had brought them full circle, from a teenage romance in a garden to a family reunited by truth and tragedy. Some secrets, Haley thought, were worth keeping, but some truths were worth dying for. The sound of her parents' laughter drifted out from the kitchen, and Haley smiled through her tears, knowing that Benjamin would have loved this moment. Love endures, she realized. Despite everything, always and forever, love endures.